Recording in progress.
Aiko, turn something off.
I can't.
I'm going to turn something off here.
I'm okay now.
Okay. All right. And we'll share screen. Okay, I hope you're seeing a map. Are you?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, well, after last week, we've talked a lot about the geology of California, and I just kept running into maps of California, and it kept being reinforced to me how unique the delta is. The delta is so far inland, and we talked a lot about that and how we've created this vast bathtub that keeps emptying and filling, and that creates unique currents out here that affected Spanish ships. And I'm convinced kept them out of the bay, in addition to the fog and Angel Island obscuring. And I kept seeing it over and over again. So this is a map from outer space, and this was taken in 1972. And you have at that period a rainstorm. There had been a lot of flooding in 72, 73. So this is a lot of sediment. And when we get to the history of the gold rush, we'll be talking about why that is and why there's so much erosion and why the delta in the bay fills up so much. And it has to do with placer mining, of course. And then the other interesting thing about this photo is the red colors, the red blotches. And these are the salt ponds. These are, nothing's been done to enhance this red color, but the salt ponds, because of a unique algae that blooms, are red from space. And then there's this good old Rand McNally topographical map, which I really love because it makes it so clear. The third dimension really helps. And you can see that this used to be the outlet to the sea. But we went over the geology, and we know that all this is relatively new land from subduction. And I went back in our old slides and I found the map just to illustrate, so you know what's creating this new land. It's the Pacific plate going underneath the continental plate, and it gets deep enough at some point that it drills down into the molten part and creates these volcanoes on the continental plate, and that's where we get the granite in the Sierras. But it keeps scraping off stuff from the top of the Pacific plate, from the seabed, from the bottom of the ocean on the Pacific plate, and that's what's created really the geology of the Bay Area and the coastal ranges. So just absolutely unique. A few miscellaneous things. I'd like to go back and look at some of the slides we did last week, but there's something I've encountered for the medical hat that I still wear. And it was a very succinct recommendation on this new triple immunization that is coming up for us. And the succinct recommendations, this is from an epidemiologist I've been following in Minnesota. RSV, a virus that causes respiratory disease, respiratory syncytial virus. The recommendation is get it as soon as it's available in your community. Don't try to overthink it. But COVID, you should wait until the new EG5 variant is covered in the immunization, and they'll announce that. So hang on until it looks like sometime in October. And the flu is, I've been following his advice for the last few years, which is to time your first immunization to the first report of a flu outbreak. And that's because the immunization wears off at the rate of 20% a month after you get your shot. So there's a disadvantage to running out and getting it early, because if it doesn't going to appear in your community for 4 months, you've lost some benefit of the shot. Now, Homer, pipe up anytime. This is right in your bailiwick. So the other miscellaneous thing is this new Oppenheimer movie. I talked a little bit about it last week, but it just continues to pop up. Last week, we looked at Oppenheimer and Ernest Lawrence in 1931. They had bonded at Berkeley, and Oppenheimer took him to New Mexico. And Lawrence, I appreciated, it was in the 30s that he really accomplished a lot. He got the Nobel in 39, and he's with Seaborg, who's going to get it in the 50s, and Oppenheimer looking at the controls of the cyclotron. And in the Oppenheimer movie, they set it up real nice. So Oppenheimer first meets Lawrence inside the cyclotron. And then talking about being inside the cyclotron. The Nobel Prize winners, UC Berkeley, 16 laureates, and both Aiko and I had Melvin Calvin for organic chemistry. And he was a great lecturer. We were all impressed that he was a Nobel laureate. But I thought I'd put up the last three, because two of them are women, interestingly enough. The resources that keep popping up for me for Oppenheimer that shed more light on what is the real story. I read the book. I think I mentioned that last week, but the book was written by two guys, and one was Marty Sherwin. He unfortunately died the month after he knew the book was contracted to Chris Nolan. And so he knew his family was going to be taken care of, but then he died. But he did a great interview with Charlie Rose in the around 2010. And they spent a lot of time talking about whether the nuclear bomb should have been used on Japan. And the missing variable on that was that Russia, the Soviets, were about ready to declare war. And so any nonsense that the decision was binary, that it was either use the bomb or suffer massive casualties by invasion, that is that is a red herring. The fact that that Russia was about ready to come into the war for sure would have forced the Japanese to surrender. But then on the other side of that, Truman maybe didn't want that. Truman and his advisors, because then they'd have to share occupation with Russia. So it's a complicated dynamic, and it's certainly not as simple as we've been led to believe. Another interesting resource is a YouTube of Oppenheimer giving a lecture in 1964, 2 years before he died. And his lecture was on Niels Bohr, who is the alpha male in the movie, in nuclear theory, all through the 30s and 40s. And then I discovered there's another documentary that on Oppenheimer that is a 97% on Rotten Tomatoes. It's called The Day After Trinity. And it's excellent. We watched it. It's hard to get. It's on the Criterion Collection. But if anybody's interested, this is a New York Times review where we discovered that this documentary that was made in 1981, so 40 years old. So if you have a chance, see that. There's an American Experience, PBS, focusing mostly on the trials. And there's a BBC miniseries starring Sam Waterston as Oppenheimer, harder to get. Oppenheimer, the movie was reviewed from the standpoint of the history by a columnist at the LA Times. And it's worth a read, I'd say, after you've seen the movie. But it takes some liberties. This, of course, is General Groves, played by Matt Damon. And in an earlier movie called Fat Man and Little Boy, he was played by Paul Newman. So this is the real life Groves and Oppenheimer. Groves weighed over 300 pounds. Matt Damon doesn't go that far. And in contrast to Oppenheimer, who got down to around 115, he was had problems with that his whole life. So this is the website for that. And this picture is taken from that article. This is the cyclotron. In the movie, you see Oppenheimer meeting Lawrence right here at this door. Here's Oppenheimer in the back row, and of course, Lawrence in the front. And this is Oppenheimer at his lecture in 1964. He didn't know it at that point, but he had throat cancer. And that's eventually what killed him. at that point, he was still running the institute at Princeton. And that's part of the movie, too, his relationship with Einstein. All right. So those were some irresistible asides that I had to make. So on to our Silk Road update. And to ease the way into the transition, this was Monday, an amazing day for clouds in the open space. So I couldn't resist including this as a soothing photo. And then I couldn't resist quoting Joni Mitchell about clouds got in my way. All right, China, still problems with the economy and getting more and more ominous. And the recent statistics that just came out last week continued downward. So that's a concern for the world. Ukraine, on the land, it's still a stalemate, although there's some interesting activity. They've crossed the lower stretches of the Dnieper, and they were, of course, flooded. And some of those minefields may have been affected that in a perverse way has cleared the way for Ukraine to open another front. We'll see. But basically a stalemate. They're still attacking the bridge, and this time they did it in the daytime. The military bloggers describe secondary explosions and traffic backups. The official Russian media did not allude to that. So through these military bloggers, we're getting the straight scoop. Yes, Aiko.
Oppenheimer never got the Nobel Prize. Was that just prejudice due to his problems, with his associations and all that?
Well, no, he was a theoretical physicist. He was great at explaining things. And when Berkeley got him because he had been in Europe and knew a lot about quantum mechanics, more than anybody in the United States in the 20s. It was all brand new. And he came back and just taught the hell out of quantum mechanics. And he was such a good teacher that there was really a cult following for him. But they don't give the Nobel for good teaching. They give it for scientific innovation. And he never pioneered anything new or fresh. He was just a great synthesizer and explainer, which is why Leslie Grove picked him in spite of his left-wing background. He insisted on picking him because of his reputation pulling things together. He suspected he'd be a great administrator, and he was. He was just a fantastic administrator. But he was never put in charge of the science behind the atom bomb. He needed an administrator who understood the science, but there were two scientists, one at Los Alamos, and that was his friend Lawrence. And then back in Chicago, there was another set of theoretical physicists that were working on the development problems. Hello, Ray. Welcome. So does that answer your question, Aiko?
Yeah, thank you very much. But one more statement. In regards to Ukraine, I had listened to, I can't remember who, if it was podcast or what, but anyway, they said that the reason why this, forward movement attack that they're trying to do is not doing so well is because they don't have the air support. And America would never go into something like that without the air support. But yet we still, haven't really given them the means for that.
Well, they're training Ukrainian pilots now in anticipation. I think they have been. I think the British have been training them, but Americans are starting to train them now with the idea of giving them F-16s. That's my understanding. Huh?
I hope it's not too late.
Yeah. Anybody else out there, speak up. All I know is what I read in the newspapers. Okay.
Hey, John. Yeah. This is Bruce. There was an article today by Paul Krugman, and I don't know if you happen to see that, but it was, normally he's the economist, but at the same time, he really was talking about the Oppenheimer, the movie, and what he's alleging in or commenting on there is the fact that there were actually several other locations where the physics was being come up with. One had to do with having to do with the being able to keep the submarines from being seen, and several other places and other people that were kind of just alluded to in the Oppenheimer movie. The other thing was just was at lunch with a fellow who was very familiar with. He worked at the Lawrence Livermore Lab, and he's talking about there about really this was from the technology was originally come up with in the UK, and ultimately with Churchill, and they needed to make sure that where they got put the bomb was in the US, and so that was where the Manhattan Project was really kind of born, was in between Los Alamos and anyway, just some other things about apparently the movie, which obviously is generating a lot of buzz.
Yeah, it sure is, and I'm certainly open. So, given the history of California, I'm certainly open to focusing on the Berkeley years in particular, and talking about it. But it's up to the group if we want to do a deep dive into this. Has anybody else read the book?
No, certainly not me, and I have not seen the movie. And so, whereas the two guys I was with today, they had seen the movie, and they were one of them who was a little familiar with some of the people. He just said that the history is a little strange, and some of that don't read. It's a story, and so, but the movie is really great, apparently. So, anyway. And I haven't seen it, so I can't comment.
Well, it sure is great. Aiko and I saw it, but another irony, and you mentioned the UK, and they certainly contributed, and they sent over a guy named Klaus Fuchs, who has been working in Britain, and of course he turned out to be the spy that informed Stalin about the program, so that at Potsdam, Stalin already knew. Potsdam was, and you'll see it in the movie, the timing of the test, the timing of the test in New Mexico. Hello, Barbara. Was being pushed so that Truman would have something to hint at with Stalin, but it was unnecessary because Stalin already knew. So yeah, there was that from Britain, and then of course there are some scenes in Oppenheimer in Chicago where a lot of important work is being done. Yes, Bob.
On Oppenheimer, I draw your attention to two recent Fresh Air episodes. They're available on podcast, of course. One was a rerun of recordings from 25 years ago. One, an interview with the author and psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton, who I don't know, but anyway, he describes in his writing an interview how American justifications for bombing were based on a myth. That was a good one. And then Fresh Air's also got, and I haven't heard it yet, has got Christopher Nolan on its last episode.
Yeah,
being interviewed about Oppenheimer. Probably also an interesting follow-up.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that, and I got it lined up. Yeah, so I think it's just a fantastic movie. It captures the essence of the history, that's for sure, and it captures the man. So if the group wants to do a deep dive on that after everybody's had a chance to see the movie, or maybe a couple of you read the book, we can do it. This is a democracy. This is okay. Anything else on Oppenheimer? Okay, so let me know if you're interested in doing a deeper dive. So Ukraine continuing to hone in on the bridge. They may not get very far on the land in the near future, but we know they're making advances on the sea with their drones, submarine drones, and they're really affecting Russian ports in the East Black Sea. So there's that. And then the bridges are vulnerable. And this is the shot of the bridge from the beach in Crimea. And it's just up the road from Yalta. We were just talking about the meeting of the big three in Potsdam. Well, before that was Yalta, which is a vacation spa town in Crimea. And this is the view that you're getting of the Kerch Bridge from a beach in Crimea. I think I've mentioned earlier that I was in Yalta in 1961 as part of a German student tour of the Soviet Union, and that was one of our stops. I would just comment that the women on this beach at the time, or near this beach, were topless when we were there, which was an interesting thing for a guy in his late teen years. The bookends, so that's China and Ukraine. But in the middle between these bookends that we're following, Silk Road bookends, is the Ottomans. And the Ottomans controlled Crimea. And this has always been important from Ottoman Turkic history, Crimea. And in light of this headline, this just reached out and grabbed me. Erdogan's open to re-engaging with the West. He's been cozying up with Russia, buying their military equipment, bad-mouthing America, accusing us of being in on that military coup attempt. And he knows that America was very much against his re-election. But he is looking west again. And I found that just remarkable and very hopeful. I'm pulling threads of hope wherever I can find it. So he's definitely flirting with the West. And you may remember a year ago, we did a session on that included Erdogan. And a year ago, he had told Putin that he should return Crimea to its rightful owners, which was stunning. And that's still his position. And why is that his position? The history, I want to go over that again to explain why he would feel so strongly about Crimea. And it has to do with the Tatars. So a year ago, when he made that statement that Russia had to give back Crimea, Judy Woodruff interviewed him. And he pointed out, listen, the Tatars are our descendants, or we're both descendants of original Turkic people, I think is what he meant to say, but that's what he said. And he said it was only fair that we relieve the Crimean Tatars. And you remember we did the history of Crimea, and that was a big thing. The Tatar presence is many centuries more than the Russian presence. And he claimed that he told Putin that in 2014, and has been disappointed by the response. So just a quick review of that history, which is totally fascinating. Russian and Turkic history collided big time in Moscow in the 15th century. And it was the Tatars versus the Ivans, who were just emerging as the leaders of Moscow. The princes of Moscow, of course, became the czars. And how did that work out? Well, Eiko and I remember when we were traveling, we kept running into Our Lady of Kazan, and we met a traveler in, of all places, Lithuania, who was vacationing. He was from Kazan, and we kind of bonded with him and got to know him. And so, what's Kazan? Well, Kazan was a Turkic area far to the east of Moscow. And that Turkic area, they were quite hardy and warlike, and they had become Muslim, but they were easily recruited by Genghis Khan. And what did Genghis Khan ask them to do? He asked them to collect taxes for him. And they put him in charge of Moscow and the area of Moscow to collect taxes. Well, the Tatars were smart, and they deputized the Moscow Slavic princes to be their collectors. And that arrangement lasted for a century or two. And finally, the Ivans resisted, and Ivan the Terrible in particularly. And there was a holy war against the Tatars in Kazan. So Our Lady of Kazan was an Orthodox painting that bolstered the spirits of these new Russian troops. Now, I say new Russian to Moscow. Moscow was just a frontier town when Kiev was a dynasty, a thriving dynasty. But it was the Moscow princes that took down the Kazans. And this is their founding war. Most countries have a founding war. Our, of course, is the revolutionary. But what happened to the Tatars in defeat, a lot of them wound up in Crimea. A lot of Tatars wound up in Crimea. And they would go back to Kazan province to visit out of tradition. So the two major cathedrals in Moscow and St. Petersburg are the Kazan cathedrals, and they each have separate icons, miraculously recovered. All of them are, and I won't go into all the detail. But this Lady of Kazan helped defeat the Poles, the Swedish, and even Napoleon. Yes, Psycho. What am I forgetting? Can't hear you.
Sorry. I thought the Tartars had used the Jews for tax collection.
No, that was the Poles, the Polish nobility.
Okay. And who are the Moscow princes? Who do you mean by that?
The Ivans. There's I think the first one was a Daniel. But there are three Ivans: the first, second, and third. And when I distill down the history to its bare essence, I'm sure that Ramsey, were he here, would be protesting. Robert.
I just quickly looked up Kazan, of course. I didn't know this, but not just right on the Volga River, not really that far from Kazakhstan, is the city of Kazan, and it is the capital, as you obviously know, of Tatarstan, which is a semi-autonomous part of, there's about 89 elements to Russian Federation. That's one of them, and it has a large mosque there. Anyway, that's all.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'm glad you're interested in this, because I am. And this was when we met this Kazani tourist in Vilnius. This was so fascinating to me that there was this history and the early clashes between Orthodox and Islam. Of course, they were more ethnic classes, and the religions were just the jerseys they were wearing. That's the metaphor I used for Northern Ireland. Didn't seem like there was much important belief in religious belief. Crimea. In 2023, back to this slide, what is Erdogan doing now that this initiative has come into view specifically? So I went through the article, and he is specifically saying he's okay with Sweden's accession, something that he's blocked for a year. That's not nothing. That's a big deal. So Sweden and Finland are going to be in NATO pretty soon. furthermore, he hosted Zelensky recently and backed his dreams of also joining NATO. I mean, this is really quite remarkable. And so maybe he's taken this Crimea occupation seriously. And to add insult to injury to Putin, he gave Zelensky 5 ex-prisoners that had come into his possession in a prisoner swap with the Ukraine. And Putin only did it for a promise that these prisoners wouldn't actually go back to Ukraine until the war was over. And so he did that for Zelensky. That's not nothing. And he's asking to join the EU. Now, as we go through his history as a politician, we'll learn that was one of the first things he asked 20 years ago. But he's putting it back on the table as something that Turkey would seriously like. And then he's cuddled up to Western investors by finally increasing interest rates, something that he's refused to do on quack economic beliefs. And maybe Bob could tell us more about that, but his refusal to raise interest rates has just driven up inflation sky high in Turkey. And that's probably why he did it. He didn't want to do it before the recent election 3 months ago. But after that election, he finally relented. And here's those F-16s again. They keep popping up. He wanted our F-16s. And when we didn't give it to him, that's when he approached Russia. One of the reasons that he started buying Russian weapons, even though he was in NATO. Biden is trying to sweeten the deal by hinting at an invitation to the White House. And apparently that's a big deal around the world. We hear America's in bad odor and we can't get anything done, but everybody wants to come to the White House. So that's something. And then the EU is saying, okay, we'll put that back on the table. We'll even strengthen the customs union that we have now. But all that may take a while. But it's interesting. It's just fascinating that this is a major chess piece on the chessboard that has been moved, and it's provocative. So I couldn't resist it. Nevertheless, Erdogan continues to bully his critics. When we were talking about the election, the strongest opponent that he could have possibly had was the mayor of Istanbul, which is ironic because he started his career as the mayor of Istanbul. But the mayor of Istanbul was locked up on phony charges, and that created a very unlevel playing field for this last election. Corruption continues to thrive. It's in his family. He continues to put the Kurds on the front burner as enemies. And of course, we're supporting Kurds both in Iraq and in Syria. And he, from time to time, says, I can always start buying weapons from Russia again. And he said, okay, I'll increase the interest rates, but it's not going to be very much. So he didn't increase interest rates enough at all And in the last few months, it shot up again at annual rate of 48%. So that's not working. He needs to take sharper measures. So we'll see. So I thought all this development would warrant a quick review of the last 20 years. And 20 years ago, Erdogan was elected. He was not an Islamist at all. He was not a nationalist. He was an internationalist. He ran on the ticket of joining the EU. And perhaps it was disingenuous. He needed a platform that would not offend the military. And they knew he was at heart an Islamist. So he turned the spotlight to shine brighter on Europe and international development. So he sought support from Jacques Chirac and Gerhard Schroeder to get into the EU, and they started talks. And Gerhard Schroeder, I just can't resist reminding everybody, when Gerhard Schroeder left the German government, he has prostituted himself to Putin. And Putin has paid him off handsomely by putting him on the board of Gazprom and all these other big Russian oligarchic businesses. So he's made a lot of money in Putin's employ. The socialists had a legitimate policy called Ostpolitik, and Gerhard Schroeder is a social democrat. And I remember when I was in Berlin in the 1960s, a very popular Willy Brandt believed in Ostpolitik. It was in the 60s, the notion of let's make nice so that the Germans and the Russians never go to war again. But Gerhard Schroeder has gone too far the other way, as we've seen. So where did things go wrong in Erdogan's evolution? So he was, as an Islamist, and he didn't make a secret of it. When he was mayor of Istanbul, he wrote Islamist poetry that got published. So he was always in tension with the bolsters, the traditionalists that held up Kemal Ataturk, who was a great military man. And so the backers of traditional Kemalism, if you will, are the military. And so Erdogan very deftly has played that tension and managed to make it through, even though the military were keeping a close watch on him every step of the way. So things got serious. There was a lot of business trips to Europe, and the early strategy was to integrate with the EU, and they were buying, making contracts for aerobuses, and even in Cyprus, which was a huge nationalist thing, Erdogan was willing to compromise. And Ankara has accepted the northern third of Cyprus. It's not a happy deal. It's more de facto, but they stopped fighting. And Erdogan thought, well, that's surely will get me into the EU. But it didn't, mainly because of Jacques Chirac, French conservative who always was intimidated by Erdogan's Islamism. Chirac thought that the EU should be a Christian club, and he was also worried that Turkey's population was growing much faster than Germany's, and soon Turkey would have a larger population than Germany's, and certainly more than France's. That has a practical impact on representation on something called the Council of Ministers, the EU's most powerful institution. So there was some religious hesitation about that, and it was a deal breaker. So when that failed, what did Erdogan do? Well, that was about the time the Arab Spring came along. So he reignited his original Islamist instincts and tried to blend it with a populism. And he started using his power to suppress secular enemies. This is when he started getting control of the media. He started throwing journalists in jail. Turkey has the worst record for freedom of speech, I think, in the world, the number of journalists arrested. So you can say in 2011, things started changing real bad. That was insufficient. So one positive thing he tried to do is he reached out to the Kurds, not just once, but a couple of times. And the 20% of the electorate are Kurdish. So he restarted the peace process. He seemed to be sincere. After all, the Kurds were Islamist, and now he'd taken off any pretense that he wasn't at heart an Islamist. So there was some hope that there'd be progress, at least on that front with fellow Sunnis. But that alienated the nationalists, and that just points out the problem in Turkey is there are just so many factions and contending religions and ethnicities. I've mentioned most of these already, but then there's also combinations of them. So it's really tricky to try to explain Turkish politics. And so the writer that I like the best on all this defines it as fluid definitions of ideology. And I mentioned her a year ago. She does a very good podcast on the history of Erdogan. She has written a couple of books on his evolution. So by 2015, Erdogan felt he was strong enough to challenge the military. And so he touted a new constitution to get rid of the old Kemalist constitution and set up a strong presidential system. But when he did that, he lost ground in 2015. But also because of the nationalist element had been turned off by his rapprochement with the Kurds. So, of course, Erdogan became a nationalist, and that he is pursuing the Kurds, even those living in Sweden. And so I think I'm going to have to start winding down here. And let me see if I can get to a better stopping point. So everybody hold on. So in 2016, the military had enough, and they launched a coup, and Erdogan's countermeasures just put his authoritarian on steroids. He went through the judiciary, through the education sector, and punished all his enemies. A lot of people went to jail. So that backfired big time. And then came the Syrian refugee crisis. And in Germany, they have a huge Turkic community already in Germany. And Syrian refugees started coming in. And initially, Angela Merkel was very altruistic. She told the Germans, "Wir können das schaffen." That means we can accomplish this. We can take care of this problem. And she thought she could absorb all these Islamic Syrians coming in. But there's already 2.5 million Turks in Germany already. And that evoked a right-wing party called the Alternative for Deutschland. And it's a shame because the EU needs immigrants. They're aging and shrinking. And that's one thing that keeps us going in America is our immigration. We need immigrants too. So really, the EU needs immigrants from Turkey, just like they needed them when I was there in the 60s and when Ramsey was there in the 60s. The Turkish immigrants kept stealing and sitting in our seats on trains that were packed anytime we headed south on a trip from Germany. So then comes this year's election. Hopes were up. The economists thought, boy, it's going to be great if they sack their strongman. But we didn't. And it's because the only candidate that Erdogan would allow was this old guy. Not that there's anything wrong with old guys, but they're underperformed, big defeat. And now Turkey has joined India, Hungary, and Iran on that V-Dem scale. They have 20 elements of civil society where they grade countries. And now Turkey is no longer a democracy. It's categorized as a competitive autocracy. And here's the V-Dem map we went over when it came out in March, and it shows Turkey deeper and deeper red. Not as red as Russia or China, but pretty darn red. Not at all blue. Okay, the age of the strong man, we keep talking about that, and that's what we're in. So I think this is kind of getting into philosophy, and this will probably be a good place to stop and resume next week. So I'm going to stop sharing and take any of your questions.
John, there's a movie that's streaming right now on
San Francisco longshoremen battled police, shutting down the waterfront just across the bay from Oppenheimer's home in Berkeley.
Oh, yeah.
America itself seemed on the verge of revolution, with violence in the streets, strikes, a failing economy, a third of the nation unemployed. But Oppenheimer remained aloof.
I had no radio, no telephone. I never read a newspaper or a current magazine. I learned of the stock market crash in the fall of 1929 only long after the event. I voted for the first time in a presidential election in 1936. I was deeply interested in my science, but I had no understanding of the relations of man to his society.
The Depression didn't affect him personally. He had an income from his father, who was wealthy, and politics seemed gross to him.
Beginning late in 1930, my interests began to change. I saw what the Depression was doing to my students. Often they could get no jobs, but I had no framework of political conviction or experience to give me perspective in these matters.
Okay,
Spring of
who's
1936, I was
playing it?
introduced
I
by
can't
friends
tell.
to Jean Tatlock. In the autumn, I began to court her. We were at least twice close enough to marriage to think of ourselves as engaged.
Hold on.
Jean Tatlock was Oppenheimer's first real love. She was 22, studying to be a doctor, and passionately involved with the contentious issues of her day. The Civil War in Spain, organized.
Okay, it popped up. This is somehow my computer started playing automatically. Sorry about that. This is that was you've been listening to the PBS American Experience. So there you go. You got a slight taste of that unwittingly. Sorry. Okay. Any other comments, suggestions, ideas about where you'd like to go next week? Otherwise, we're headed back to post Cabrillo. We have on the horizon Sir Francis Drake, which will bring up the tensions between Spain and England, which are totally fascinating. We'll have a century after that, Junipero Serra, which is totally fascinating. So we got some interesting stuff on the horizon, but I'm certainly willing to explore anything the group wants to explore. If you don't want to mention it now, send me an email, and I'll put them all together, and we'll see if we should take another direction. Other than without that, I will proceed next time in the direction of Sir Francis Drake. I will tarry just a bit to talk about the microbial invaders that the Spanish brought with them. We've already seen the disastrous smallpox epidemic for the Aztecs, but we don't see that in the New World because of the different lifestyles, the smaller villages versus the urban environment of Tenochtitlan. But we'll talk a little bit about the seeds and how the sea fig got to the shores of California is totally fascinating. So I'll just float that as a teaser. Whichever direction we go, there's just amazing things that happen in this world.
John, I have tickets for Oppenheimer, which is going to do next Thursday. People said go to the Metreon. So if you haven't seen it, there are a few tickets left. As a senior, it's still $21. And you get a reserved seat. And so, but people did say I think at that we're like third row, just off center. There's not many seats left. It's quite popular, but
it should be. Yeah, Aiko.
Johnny, you're still recording, I think.
Yeah.
Oh, I thought you said you stopped it.
No, I stopped the PBS American Experience.
Okay. All right.
Couple comments. I think on the oh shoot, that's that. Oh, there's a movie now streaming on Netflix. It's called The Swimmers, and it's really about the Syrian and the what the Syrians were having to do to get out of Syria at that point in time, and there's a huge migration, and just to see what was involved with that. So that's a very interesting movie. Secondly, is basically Doc Hale, who's who we had that open house last weekend. He talked, and it was one of the things he talked about was the seed bank. When you're talking about the seeds of the figs, one of the things is that apparently when the Spanish came in here, they brought the seeds that ultimately turned the Golden Gate into what we see now. It's all burned out, it's all dry grass and looks like the Golden Hills. Originally, that was basically all perennials, and it was not the grass that were the 13,000 years of the Native Americans saw, and when they were here. So it was a very interesting lecture.
So Bruce, we live on open space. I've walked with David there and Homer there, and it's all invasive, except there's a local retired landscaper who is devoting his retirement to converting a hillside to the original plant life and eliminating the thistles and the
is that the one off, is that off of Sutherland?
Yes.
Yeah, I know that. I know the hill as well.
Phil's Hill.
Yeah.
Phil's Hill. Yeah, we know Phil. Yeah. So Phil's Hill, and the interesting thing, fascinating, where did he get the original seeds? He got them from the quarry on Shell Ridge, interestingly enough, from the quarry on Shell Ridge, and in the crevices from where sandstone had been mined, original seeds got in there. And the advantage they had in an abandoned quarry was the cattle couldn't get to them and eat them because it was too rocky. And so they have taken off in the crevices of this quarry, and Phil goes there and transplants these seedlings onto his hill. I don't know if he has other sources, but fascinating project. Okay, y'all. See you next week.
Thank you, John.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
John.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, John.
Sure. Bye-bye.